thank you all for joining. This is a practical starter guide to SQL Notebooks. So when I was thinking about this session, this is really what I wanted to call it. So this is also so we can level set. So I really want to learn how to use SQL Notebooks, but I don't have time to figure it out at work either. So let's go on a quest to do this stuff together, right? Quest, we get it? D&D, we're all good? All right. So for those of you who don't know me, I've been a DBA working with database platform for a really long time. I'm a board member of the New England SQL Server User Group. I am based in the Boston, Massachusetts area in the US. A couple other things, Azure Data Community Advisory Council. For those who may be interested, we just kicked off something called Witspiration, which is a women in tech mentoring circle. If you're interested, talk to me more about it. You can talk to me about any of these later. I was the last Speaker Idol winner in 2019. I was a Dear Ace, class of 2020. I am one of the Redgate 100, and I am most honored to be a Microsoft MVP of the data platform. The really important stuff to know about me is really this stuff. I'm the alto section leader of my choir. I do bluegrass jams regularly. I've been learning guitar. I've been neglecting a mandolin. I love musical theater. Don't get me started. Or maybe do. We'll talk later. And if nothing else, my husband and I like taking pictures of our dog doing geeky things like, you know, unpacking DBA tools books, reading computers, and so on and so forth. That's just who we are. So really important things to remember about me. The other stuff doesn't matter. Okay, but that's not why you're here. We can talk later. What we're here to do is talk about SQL Notebooks. So we're going to get to know the SQL Notebook interface, and then we're going to go through a couple use cases, because when we think about a new tool, the biggest thing is like, how do we use it? What is it good for? You know, this is great, but I can't figure out when I go back to work, what does it mean? How can I start using it? So that's really what I want to focus on. How can we use SQL Notebooks? And the best way to do that is to just dive into them. So we're going to spend most of our time in Azure Data Studio, because when we talk about SQL Notebooks, that's really where things live. One of the things that you're going to want to do is you're going to go to your extensions, and you're going to want to make sure you have the things that you need for notebooks, specifically this, the Jupyter Notebook extension. And it's going to tell you what you need to do in terms of like what you have to install, how to do it. I highly recommend reading these because they actually spend time figuring out what you want to see. You may have a couple other extensions, and they will tell you that, it prompts you, it walks you through the process. It's great. So it's a very quick way to jump in and get started and set up your Azure Data Studio for that. By the way, if you're not familiar with Azure Data Studio, everything is through extensions. Make sure you find which ones you want to use, and they're all going to be here. So I'm going to close that, and then we're going to spend our time focusing on our notebooks. The first thing is really, what are the different pieces of a notebook? So I'm going to close this and just hide over here so we can get more screen real estate. Can you all see in the back? Does it look good? You got it? I see thumbs up. All right. So there are really two types of cells that are available to you in a notebook. One are your text cells, and one are your code cells. A couple other things I want to point out. Here's how you can add cells, and you have a choice for code cell or text cell. You can move cells around. So like if I have this cell here and I click on it, I've got up arrows, I've got down arrows, so I can move it where I want it to be. I will go into editing in just a second. The other things I'm going to point out right now is this kernel. So when we talk about SQL Notebooks, initially we're going to start off with SQL kernel, but it's also one kernel per notebook for what we're going to start with. We can get into multiple kernels in a moment or a little later. But right now it means you can do SQL, you can do PySpark, you can do Python, you can do PowerShell. I've got an example of it later. We're going to start off with SQL, and then we're going to also talk about connections. We need to be able to connect someone when we're doing a SQL notebook. And you're going to have different options depending on which kernel you're doing. And when you choose to change your connection, if you're familiar with Azure Data Studio, it pulls up your regular connection details. So you're going to figure out your connection, and you're going to connect same way you would for any other query that you would in Azure Data Studio. So we're going to start by, I'm going to connect to my SQL 2019 instance for now. So now let's kind of start diving into what we can do with the cells. Now, when I first saw demos using SQL Notebooks, it's this documentation, it's these text cells that really made me say, I want to know more about this tool. Because what do we do now when we have a query window? Let's jump over to this thing right here. I've got comments, I've got all the different text and things, and it's all this green things because of my comments been between my code and all that sort of stuff. It's kind of ugly, I'm not gonna lie. But you can do pretty things here in your notebooks, and you can do a lot more. You can already see here, I've got headers, I've got different paragraphs, I've got bullet points. It makes it just that much easier to read. And if we look at the next one, we can start figuring out how we can modify things. So what we find out is these text cells are really just a markup language. Or markdown language. There's a site which has all sorts of things, and if you notice, I'm hovering over, and you can see that I've got an HTML link embedded in my notebook. So I can click this, and it's going to go to that URL. You can see here that I have an option to do a split view. So now I can see my markdown, and I can see what the changes are. Or if I want, I can just look at my entire markdown if that's how I choose to work. I kind of like the WYSIWYG editors. I just find them easier unless I screw something up. But you've got some basic editing you can do here. For example, I can make this bold. I can make this italic, underline. I can do highlights. Move it and you can see it, like kind of getting fancy here. We can get even fancier and we can use images. So I'm going to go here, and then I happen to have an image open. I find you really do need to have the images open in order to do something. So let's take this guy and put him in here. And so now we have our nice little image. It's a little big, but yeah, you can resize it. It's, I'll let you play at home. And like I said, so you can kind of see there's a lot you can do with this, and you can make it pretty. So if you want to be able to share your document or your notebook with someone else, make it look really professional, you can do that. So that's one of the cool things about the text cells. A lot more you can do about it. But for me, I'm a little more interested in what we can do with the cells, right? I'm a code person, I'm a developer, I want to work with my code. This is great documentation. So now let's get into how do the cells work? Because you can see that things are broken up a little bit differently because of the way the cells work. So using our Management Studio as a reference, hopefully we're all familiar with the way a basic query works in Management Studio, or even that query window that I was just showing you in Azure Data Studio. So how does the code work in a notebook? So I'm going to start off by running this code cell. You can see it's a code cell. You see I have a little run button, and if I click on it, I've got a couple different options. You can make things, parameterize your cells. I'm not going into that here, but I can take this and I can run this. And if we scroll down, this is pretty basic select statements. You can see I've got my two result sets together. My first statement, this is my second statement. Now, when we done this through a query window, we have the ability to do things like highlight our statement, and when we run it, it just runs that one statement. So what happens here? It doesn't. So it's an all or nothing when you execute code in the cell. So if you only want one thing executed, make sure that that's the only thing that's not commented. Because you can still use comments in your code cells. It's just you can't run. You still need to comment everything out if you only want that one thing run. A couple of things to note about what the result sets have. We have things like we can export that to CSV, Excel, JSON. We can say Markdown. We can even create charts if we had data that made sense as a chart. So you can do that all here. One thing you don't have, which is I kind of think is a bummer, we don't have query plans. So if you like running things and you want to see the execution plan, you can't get it from here unless you pull it out of a DMV and then you click on it, go to the XML. I kind of wish they had that. It doesn't seem like it's one of those things that's coming right now. All right, so let's see what else we can do. So now that we see this, what else? Let's think about the scope of a cell. What is the scope? That's a really big thing. So for example, variables. Right now we know that the variable has to run in the batch in order for things to come through. Same here, let's find out. Declaring a variable, setting up a default value, running that, that's good. All right, so now let's see what happens when I run select in the next cell, and it's kind of what you expect. I forgot to include the variable, so it doesn't know that it's there. So that part is still the same. Variables work as expected, which means I've got to do the same thing. The variable has to be in the cell that's being select. Run that here. Again, basic behavior that we'd expect. So now let's think in terms of transactions. So let's use explicit transactions. So I'm going to switch to my superheroes database. Sorry, I didn't have time to change it to Dungeons and Dragons. We're going to stick with superheroes. And I'm going to begin a transaction. And I like naming my transactions because I want to know where I am. So when I do things like this, I'm changing my database. And now I'm going to check to see if my transaction is still open. I put dbcc open tran even though it usually doesn't have anything until you actually do something. But the DM active transactions does. So that's what we see here. And we don't have, oh, here it is. Sorry, we do have it, the cell to cell. So this is my explicit transaction. So we can see I have an open transaction. So now we can do an update and see what happens. So I'm going to make myself Wonder Woman because it's my demos and I can do that. And now we can look at our results. And I'm Wonder Woman, yay! So now let's go look at our transactions, confirm, see everything is open. Oops, I hit that twice, sorry. And we can see dbcc open tran returns information. And yep, we can see that my transaction is still in fact open, right? Cool, so this means I've got an open transaction right now. So all the things that go on with open transactions can go on. Someone else trying to update that table, they're blocked because I've got it open. So this also means things like if you create a temp table, again, you created the temp table, you ran it, you go to run the next thing, that temp table is still there. It's all part of that same session, or session ID, I should say. We can run locks, see that I've got those locks held because I like blocking other people. And all right, so we can kind of get the basic idea of how these cells interact with each other. It's kind of the same way as you run each code in your query and you run. But here's the other thing before I hit rollback. Notice all my results are still here and they're all tied to the query that I ran to get it. That's the cool thing about what we're seeing, is we have the results and we can sit there and we can scroll up and we can see those we can see our queries and we can see the results that are tied with it. Think about if you have to hand it off to someone else and you had like 10 queries and they hand you that Excel spreadsheet with 10 worksheets and you're like, this one goes with this one over here. You don't have to do that because it saves it, or it's all in that same worksheet, in that same notebook. So all right, let's roll back and we'll confirm that everything is back to where it was beforehand. And I liked it better when it was up and it was Wonder Woman, but that's okay, we'll do that later. But the next thing is select versus print. Because again, these are little things. How do behaviors work? What does a select look like versus what a print looks like? It's just how I work and how my brain works trying to figure out how this works. So select. We can see the messages are still here, and we have our select statement in the grid, and a print statement is just that. It's printed below. Nothing fancy with it, but we still are able to get our print statements. And so now this actually means that if you notice above, if I did these together, my print statement would be here, and my select statement is here. So now I'm able to combine them together instead of having to switch tabs between my messages and my cells or my grid for the results. So depending on how you want to work, it's kind of a cool thing. So, but the other thing is, when we think about the way that this is constructed, and especially when we talked about the transactions and stuff, one of the things that it really comes down to is each of these is an individual batch. So pretend you put the word go in between each select statement. That's kind of what we did. And we can actually prove it because when we looked at a query, let's go back to that one I just showed you. This is just a regular query. Actually, this is from another session that I do. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of show how we can take this and turn it into a notebook, because that's a really convenient thing. I've got something, this page that I have would look really well as a notebook because I've got all these comments and it'd be just so much easier to read. So there is an option when you have the query window open in Azure Data Studio, export as a notebook. So I'm going to click this and we now have a notebook. But we can see a couple things that happened here. One, it picked up my comment before my statement. Here it happened to figure out that it's a comment and it put it in a text cell. And now I've got my statement here in my code, and now it did a little bit of formatting for some of that other bigger comment that I had for sections. But notice if I didn't have the word go in between, it still put it all together in a single cell. So a cell is everything that you put within the word go, or whatever your batch command is, essentially. So that's actually a nice, quick, and easy way to take your scripts and turn them into a notebook. So now that I have this one here, let's look at another quick thing before we kind of jump into an example of how we can use this. I really think how connections work inside the notebook are an important thing to think about, because we talk about databases, right? Which database are we in? And this is one that you really do need to keep track of when you're working with a notebook. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to change my connection, and I'm going to connect to that same 2019 instance. But before I do that, I just kind of want to show something here. For those who notice, I'm just going with my default database and my connection. I didn't specify anything here. So let's take a look and figure out where we are. So I'm just going to do a quick select database name. Where am I? And the answer is I'm in my master database. Because again, that's my default for this particular connection. I didn't specify it. So now, let's change connection in a different cell. Now I'm changing my superheroes database. And then, superheroes. But what happens if I go back and change the date and go back up here, where it was my master database? It's now my superheroes database. Because again, when you work in your query, like you do in a query window, if you make a change and go back to before you changed your database, it's going to be in whatever database you've changed it to. It doesn't automatically know up here I want it to be in my master database, down here I want it to be in superheroes. You have to tell it. And unlike a query window, this doesn't give you much information when you look at it. So it's one of those things you really want to be careful about if you're doing cross-database work inside a single notebook, just because you got to make sure you know where you are. I mean, you need to know that anyway. You don't want to accidentally go over to the production database on that instance and run something. You need to be careful here as well. So just be warned about that. And with that, let's get into example. Because my biggest thing is, how do you use it? Now that we kind of have that opening idea of what those different cells are, let's think of how we use that. Before we move on, are there any questions? All right, let's move on. Let's go to, so this is kind of an example of where I thought SQL Notebooks work well, and we can kind of get an idea. I use them all the time for run books. So this is where I'm running that same query over and over again. I want to remember why I'm running this particular query, what it's looking for. So this is kind of one of those scenarios. ETL loads. Something always goes wrong, right? So we're always having to run those same queries to figure out what happened. Why does our data not work the way we wanted it to? So our scenario is, let's say I am support, we got the problem about ETL. So what happens is our intern, Andy the intern, he's been doing the load task. Yeah, he's waving in the back. You can bug him later. So lately they've been getting these repeatable errors. We kind of figured out what those queries are. But we want to figure out what the data is looking like, get it back to the developers, figure out if it's something with the client, or figure out if it's something with their code that they need to fix. But this is why we have something highlighted. Because we're going to run this constantly, we don't want it stuck with client data. We want to keep it clean, but we want to save off that data and hand it over. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take this notebook and we're going to save it off. We're going to make a copy. And I'm going to save it in a SQL bits 20 23 thing. All right. And just, whoops, SQL bits. So now we have this. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to look for any history records before 2020. See, the nice thing about the comments is now we get to understand why we're making these changes. So we have our system was only created in 2020, so we shouldn't have any records between then and today. Or there should only be records between then and today. I may have my comments wrong. But if there's any records that are found before the system was created, we know that there's something wrong, right? So that's our first query. So if we run this, let's connect to our superheroes database. And we can see there are 4 rows affected. And we'll scroll down. And we can kind of see a little bit of information. Actually, is this right? Oh, yes, because these are all before the timestamp. Yes, I know my data. All right, so now we can see that we've got some old data in here. It shouldn't have been loaded, so that's our first thing that developers need to know. The next is, let's check the error log for the ETL, see if anything happened. Are there any errors that were reported as part of the load? And we do, so now we can see these, and we can pass this information on to the developers later. We have things like good deeds aren't found, we have people not found, we have weird translation errors, mismatched values. So great, we can look at that, we can pass it on, developers can look at this later. But a couple of these we can investigate now. We've got the code, we run these often, let's see what's going on. So let's start with person not found. We know there are 2 common errors. We can document those here so whoever's running it knows what they're looking for. So let's start by looking at the person not found. We have 2 records. So again, we have 2 reasons that exist. So I can scroll down, have my 2 queries. Names are reversed, person needs to be added, so names are reversed. We've got our query here. We can see one. I'm sorry, the first one's person not found. Okay, names are reversed, we're expecting this. Things are in the wrong order. All right, so we need to fix that load file. The next one, we have someone who needs to be added. Well, everyone's supposed to be there, so who's not? Okay, we're not finding Tony Stark for some reason. So we're not sure why that is, but let's take a look at our person table. Like, that seems a little odd. So we need to confirm our list. We got 15 names here. A lot of these look right. And oh, what are these ones doing here? Those look like junk data to y'all? I think so. Let's see. Oh, hey, we have a note. Isn't documentation awesome? A client is known for bad record in that person file, and we can't change it because we all know clients get stuck with that bad data in their file that we can't get rid of. But we already have permission to remove those records. So because of that, we've got the code that's needed. And because let me show you why I'm doing this. One, if I have to delete production data, I always like to keep a copy of it just in case I accidentally screwed up and I want to see it later. And I know there's only 3 records, so I'm going to select those 3 records so I have the data. And then I know it's there, so I feel a little better hitting this one. I have a healthy DBA paranoia of deleting data, right? But I know what it was before if I ever have to go back and put it in for some reason. All right, so that's taken care of. We know this, we run this all the time, we've got our data, right? This is our run book. So now what's the next one? Good deed not found. Again, documentation, what data are we expecting? It's right here. So now we can confirm whether that data, that the good deed that wasn't found should exist. So let's run our query. We have 1 row. Foiled Hydra. Wait a minute. I can scroll up here. I don't have to do another query. I've already told myself what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be there. Well, that's weird. So now I can go. Let's see what's in my list, because that should have been there. Is there bad data? Is there a hidden character? And yeah, that list doesn't look right. What's that one? Steal from the poor, gift. I think this is wrong. We've got a problem here. I think at this point we probably should stop and send this over to the developers, right? So I'm going to save this. I'm also going to go ahead and close this, because here's the cool thing about notebooks, is the files, when you save them and you have results in those cells, they're saved with the cells. So I can scroll down here. I hit this side button and it's showing me all the notebooks in this particular folder. Then I'm going to scroll down, and somewhere in here, unless it's not saved yet, let's go over here then. And I've got my Explorer, and I can go down to SQL Bits. I'm going to right click and I'm going to open. Move it back over here for real estate purposes. Collapse. And we can scroll down, and hey, look, there are all my results. Again, you don't have to cut it, send it to Excel and say, okay, this worksheet 1 is this query, worksheet 2 is this one, or find some way to coordinate that. It's all in the notebook, and it's all there, and you can take it and you can save it. Now here's the one thing though, we're saving data. If there is sensitive data here, one thing to keep in mind about notebooks is really behind the scene, all they are JSON files. So you can technically take this notebook, right-click it, and open it in Notepad++, and you see everything. So it does mean if you are saving your data in a notebook, be very careful where you do it. Like, I wouldn't update it to a public GitHub, especially if there's sensitive data in there, just because, you don't know who can get to it, data security, privacy, all those sort of good things. So when you do this sort of thing, be very careful if you do have sensitive data in it. Again, it's just a JSON file. Any questions about this so far? All right. So now let's talk about a different kernel. Let's talk about PowerShell, because, as DBAs, we use a lot of PowerShell. And so let's kind of do the same thing. So I'm going to, everything scroll down. All right. So let's start looking at PowerShell the same way we looked at SQL Server, the SQL kernel. Now, a note for PowerShell is Python has to be installed for it to work. I'm not sure the connection, but the first time you go to a PowerShell kernel, drop from the drop-down, and if you don't have Python installed, it's a really, I'm going to put the word complicated in quotes, process. So Python needs to be installed. So you got 2 steps. Step 1, tell it where you want to install. I just went with the default. Step 2, hit install. It's really complicated, but it does it for you, and then you're all set to go with PowerShell. Normally, when you first open a notebook with PowerShell, it will actually open the PowerShell terminal for you. Control, I think it's tilde or tag. I can pull it up down here. So the cool thing is, as you're developing a PowerShell notebook, you can go back and forth between either the notebook cell and here, and you can make sure your PowerShell works. I do that fairly frequently when I work with that. So, but let's do some of the same tests we did to kind of figure out cell behavior in our Python kernel, or sorry, PowerShell kernel. Also make sure that you have the latest SQL Server module installed for PowerShell from the PowerShell gallery, just to make sure that you have everything updated. I'll get to the reason why in just a moment. So we've got 2 things. So first, we're going to do our variable test, because I don't know about y'all, but I use variables all the time in PowerShell. So I'm setting my variable, and I'm running it, and it's here. And you know what? That's exactly how it works in a PowerShell terminal. You create the variable, you do stuff, then you can go back to it, and there it is. The value is still maintained. So next thing is changing kernels. Keep this in mind, because we're going to talk a little bit more about this later. So can we run SQL? So one thing to note is down here, it shows the cell as PowerShell. If I did a select, yeah, that's not going to, it actually doesn't do anything, but it's not running because it's not a SQL kernel, it's PowerShell. You'd have to switch to SQL. But then this gets into everything on this notebook would then be SQL, not PowerShell. So when we talk about a notebook a basic notebook in Azure Data Studio, it is one kernel only. So let's go back to PowerShell. Because the next thing we need to think about is, what version of PowerShell are we running? I think the latest PowerShell version is like 7.2, maybe. I don't think 7.3 is out, but I think it's 7.2 or higher. So what are we running from our notebook? So I'm running the check here, and it's 5.1. I think I tried using PowerShell in a SQL Server Agent notebook, and it's still 5, or a SQL Server Agent job, and I think that may still be 5.1. So you want to be really careful if you're doing something that requires a higher version of PowerShell. Be careful when you use notebooks. I haven't figured out if there's a way to upgrade it here. My personal laptop is running 7.2, so you can see that it's not picking it up directly from here. That's something I keep meaning to look into, but that's definitely one of those things I'm going to put out there. As you're working with notebooks, especially with PowerShell, keep that in mind, what version if you're working, especially if you've got some weird stuff because of what modules are available to you in that version. It hasn't hit me too much as a problem, but every now and then I've had a couple issues. But it is important to note, because the next thing gets into privileges. Who are you running as? So I just opened my Azure Data Studio and I'm running from here. But certain things like I want to run DBA tools, or I don't have them installed. You need certain level permissions in order to run those. So you always want to check, what is this running under? So I found this cool code on the internet because I'm not smart enough to figure this stuff out. So it creates this function that says, are you the administrator? So if I were to run this, it says false. I am not the administrator. If I were to open Azure Data Studio as an administrator, it will run and say, yes, I am the administrator. That's the thing with Azure Data Studio. Whenever you're running here, if you were to open it as a different user, that's the context you're running under. Because I know one of the things is sometimes, even for the notebooks and other connections, I know for work, for Management Studio, I have to connect as a Windows user who's not my typical user. When I open Management Studio and I go open to Azure Data Studio, it will open underneath that context. So my SQL Server Windows Administrator connection would be under that. This would be under that user as well, just because it's running under the context of who's running Azure Data Studio or who's running the notebook. So again, as we start thinking about privileges, it's one of those things doesn't hit you right away until you need it and it matters. So that's kind of one of the things to think about, what context that you're running the notebooks under. So when we think about that, now let's think about how could we use PowerShell in a notebook? Well, the biggest thing for me is trying to set up an environment. I've got this scenario where I need to run a test. And I want to run a test. I need to take my superheroes database. I need to create a backup. And then I need to deploy it to a Docker container because I'm going to set up some tests I need to run later. And this is something I have to do all the time, right? It's repeatable. I'm setting it up for QA. They get to do whatever they want. And, it's frequently enough. And, PowerShell is a great way to do it. So to show there's nothing up my sleeve, we can see I have a Docker container, my Docker desktop, no containers open. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set things up for a demo. By the way, all of this stuff is available on my GitHub, so you'll be able to play with this later if you're interested. And then we'll make sure that password gets changed to something else. I'm going to set my credentials in PowerShell. Now I'm going to run a quick check to see if my container exists. We know it doesn't because you just saw that. But again, this is something I'm going to run frequently, and so we need to make sure, is it there? Do I need to do something else? Did that run? Well, because there's no containers. That's why I'm not getting a result. So now we get to see if I need to create the containers. Should be getting a result down here. Yep, practical starter guide container does not exist and needs to be created. Okay. So now I can go create it. So that takes a couple seconds. Oh, whoop, there it is. It says it started, but let's just confirm. All right. So now, just to show, hey, look, I got a container. Whoops, I have a container. It's running. Woohoo! All right. So now I'm going to create a DAC pack from my existing database. I believe this is also DBA tools. So look, I can use DBA tools inside my notebook. Why? Because it's just a PowerShell module. And I'm doing the same thing by publishing it. I don't think I need to wait the 10 seconds because I think my container is probably started. So I'm just going to take it. I'm going to publish my DAC pack to my instance. Takes a couple seconds. Maybe I did need that extra 10 seconds to make sure it started. But while it's doing that, I'm going to go over to my connections. And I've got my Docker here. Enable trust certificate, because that's new. Hey, look, here's my superheroes database. So again, now QA can go and run off and do what it needs to do. So again, this is a repeatable process. Again, it's these run books. That's really what I like about notebooks. Not only are they repeatable, but you've got those definitions right there for you. And it really helps to make sure that things are reset the way you want it to. Now, as I mentioned, these notebooks are one kernel only. One of the biggest questions when I first started presenting was, well, I want to do PowerShell, I want to do SQL, and I want them in the same notebook. Well, you can. There is something, it was originally introduced as .NET Interactive Notebooks. It started off in VS Code, and then you were allowed to do an Azure Data Studio. In November, they changed the name of it. It's still a .NET Interactive kernel, but they changed the name to Polyglot. So Polyglot, if a person is a polyglot, they speak multiple languages. A polyglot notebook can do multiple languages. Unfortunately, with the latest releases of Azure Data Studio, it's not quite working, and they say use Visual Studio Code right in the meanwhile. So we're going to switch over for that demo. It is officially listed as being in preview. So be aware that they do make changes. So this is the demo that every time I'm getting ready to do this presentation, there's something that changes. So because of that, I'm going to put the cautionary warning of make sure everything works and test it. Again, they're making lots of changes, and I think it's got some cool potentials with it. I've seen some really cool demos that Microsoft has put up about it. So Visual Studio Code is where we are now. You'll notice it looks like a lot like Azure Data Studio. That's because Azure Data Studio was built off of VS Code, the code base. So you'll see a lot of overlap. Again, you'll want extensions. You'll make sure you have the Polyglot notebook. And I'm pulling this up because actually the demo that if I can get to show you, I actually used their examples in this extension documentation on how to create it. So it's actually very useful. There is one major requirement, making sure you have .NET 7 SDK. A lot of these different changes that they make will require you to upgrade your SDK. It's not something I normally do, but I'll put that out there as an example. So let's take a look at an example. One of them is, I do this presentation, I need to reset it. I want to make sure that everything is ready, so that way I can confirm that when I do a demo, the data is what's expected. So I have a couple notes on here as well, but let me show you how it works. The first thing that you have to do is you have to pull down the .NET Interactive SQL, I guess it's a package. So this is what's going to make us be able to use .NET Interactive and use a SQL module. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. Hopefully it works. Every now and then they make upgrades and it doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. This one is still good. So I can do things like restore my database back to the original. So I'm creating a connection. And so, whoops. Clearly I've run this one already. But what I do is I create a connection to the database. Actually, I'm going to switch to, I've saved a good backup here, so let me see if I can open that quickly. File, open file, demo backups. This one may be a little faster. So you can see I ran the package, everything was downloaded. I did cleanup, so I created a kernel, and I'm naming it SQL My Database here. And so it's created the connection to my SQL 2019 instance, and I believe this is also, it's to my master database, because I want to restore my database, so I don't want to be open in it. Then I can drop the databases that I need to do. This one had an example where I had a published database. If it was there, I wanted to drop that. Here I did a restore. So you can see I did my restore, again, my SQL code. You can see how long it took to process. You can see where I took the backup from. And again, this one, I think I had an extended event session that I wanted to get rid of, so I made sure that's all cleaned up. And then I had a directory cleanup. Let's say I wanted that DACPAC directory gone, or the other thing is I want to remove that Docker container. So I can show you, hey, look, I created a Docker container. So you can see here where I went through the code where I removed the folder I wanted to remove from my DACPAC, and I removed my container. Again, this is something I ran. Look, all my results are here saved with a notebook, so it's easier to show you. The other common question I get with Polyglot Notebooks is, can you share information between the different cells of different languages? Because that's kind of the cool thing, right? There are some cool demos. I have those in the resources at the end of my slides, but I remember I said that I had that extension, the extensions documentation. I followed that and I created a really kind of messy version of it. So let's see if I can get this to work. I want .NET Interactive, whoops. So now I'm setting up because every time you have to do a Polyglot Notebook, every single time it wants to do this. It's not letting me share right now. Let's close that. Let's try this one more time. If not, I have the demo. It's not pretty, but but hopefully it will work. Let's do file. I was very proud of myself when I got this to work. I'll be very disappointed if it doesn't behave. It may be because I'm not on the network. Right? Takes a couple seconds. It's promising. No. It may be because it's loading, but let me show you. I can kind of show you the idea anyway. I would connect to my notebook. In the cells, one of the cool things here is when you do a .NET Interactive Notebook and you're connecting to your SQL, you have to use this to say what you're connecting to. So this is kind of my connection. And what I'm doing here is I'm naming my query results. So what I'm doing is this is now my query, and I'm having a name. So then I can go, and the other important thing is it's still in C#. It's not SQL. And here, sorry, you can notice where you've got the PowerShell code at the bottom of each cell, and here it says the SQL at the bottom of the shell. To share the data from SQL to PowerShell, it's still C# because I guess it's putting it in a C# object that it's then able to pass over to PowerShell, because I'm saying share, I'm saying the connection, and then the name of the result, that query result. And then my variable is the name of the query result for PowerShell, and I can run, and now I can go get my data. I'm not quite sure why that package fails. Like I said, it can be temperamental sometime. I'm not quite sure if it's because of the connection. I can probably connect and try that if we have enough time. If we have 7 minutes, wow, we're plowing. Are there any questions as I'm doing this? Let's see if I can get this to work.
So for the SQL, the extension, the markup is hash exclamation mark in there. Say you got SQL in there in polyglot format.
Hold on 1 second. All right, what was your question one more time?
So when you are running in a mix PowerShell and SQL mode in polyglot format of this one, for SQL statement, you have to say hash and exclamation mark as part of?
Okay, so the question is, when you are in a Polyglot Notebook, do you have to include this piece of code, the hash and the exclamation point, yes, you do, because what this is right now is this is my connection. This is how the notebook knows where I'm connecting to. So if I have multiple databases I need to connect to, I have to create multiple versions of these in order for me to connect to those different notebooks. Does that answer your question? Okay. When sharing a notebook, is it possible to include the connection? That's a great question. If you're connecting through a polyglot notebook, yes, because it would be written in the cell. If you're doing just like a SQL notebook and you're taking it from to another, that connection is based on what you have in your connection strings for Azure Data Studio. So as long as that person has what the Azure Data Studio connection is, they would be able to connect. You could use documentation or something else, but it's not shared the same way it would be for a polyglot. As long as they can connect to it, they would be able to run that notebook. All right, so let's see if I can get this to work. Sometimes you have to close and retry, so don't save. Let's try this one more time. If not, we'll move on. I was so excited to get this to work. Demos. All right, let's move this. Crossing fingers. Any other questions? It worked. All right, now we're in business. Like I said, this is really cool stuff, and when it works, it's just really cool. When it doesn't, it's a little frustrating, I gotta be honest, but I still think it's worthwhile. All right, so now notice the cell is still C#. You can see it in the bottom corner. Running 12 rows affected. Ready? Let's see if we're gonna share it. And it's not going to be the prettiest results, but there's our data. Isn't that cool? So we went from PowerShell, from our SQL Server to PowerShell in a notebook without having PowerShell to call directly. So again, it's kind of cool that we can do this. There are some really cool examples. So if you do C# and they've shown C# to HTML and JavaScript. So there's some really cool examples out there. The one thing I will point out is the different options you have available to you, C#, F#. The one thing that would be really cool is Python, but that's not an option here, unfortunately. Is there a reason to use Data Studio if Visual Studio is able to do more? It depends on your preference. I like Azure Data Studio because that's where I tend to live, but you could probably do it in Visual Studio Code if you want. Polyglot doesn't have Python notebooks for some reason, or you'd have to do Python separately, so you can look it up. It's your preference because it both works the same. So, my note, did we check in the code? I do have the code on my GitHub. It'll be available for you, so I'll give you that in just a moment. But again, it's Azure Data Studio, VS Code. As long as you've got the extension set up, you can check it right in from the same workspace. So a couple advantages. That documentation, that's really cool. The ability to save results with your queries, that's kind of nice. Same tool, multiple queries. Again, that's the question we just got. Whatever works for you. Cool thing I didn't get a chance to show you, you can run it, PowerShell can run a notebook, or you can put it in a SQL agent job. There are constant updates to Azure Data Studio, so they're always making changes. There's a pro and a con. The experienced team that puts the tools together, they are paying attention. They want these tools to work for us. So I think it's a really cool thing because you don't find that often, and the fact they want this to work and they're listening and they're trying to make sure that this is great, I think is a wonderful thing. One thing I didn't mention here is there's a lot of connections between Management Studio and Azure Data Studio where you can export things directly to a notebook or open a new notebook from Management Studio. So if you're interested in playing more, that'll work. We do have some limitations, as you can kind of saw. The polyglot was not, I'm still having issues working with it, but when it works, it's really cool. It's technically still in preview. We don't have execution plans, and of course, it's adjusting to a new tool. So however long that takes for you to work and figure out a new tool, it's one of those things you can figure out. There's a lot of different references. Again, these slides will be made available to you, so you can go look them up. So there are examples of notebooks that Microsoft has available. Some of them are from 2019, so you can see that. Know that there are changes for 2022. There's a really cool YouTube about the power of polyglot notebooks. That's got some of the examples of how it works with some of the other different languages, if that's what you work with. Some more dev blogs. And a couple references, Glenn Berry, if you know his diagnostic queries, they're available in notebooks. So just think about how many queries you're having to scroll through. You can now do it through a notebook, and that's kind of a nice way to do it. There's some automation blog posts out there. Rob Sewell has something for creating notebooks in PowerShell, so you can do that too if that's your kind of thing. And there's Slack, there's Twitter. And most importantly, feedback. Let me know if this was useful. If it wasn't, please let me know what I can do better next time other than making sure that I had the internet connection started. I want to know how I can make this better if it wasn't useful for you. If it was, I'd love to know that as well. Hopefully it gives you a bunch of ideas. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Here's my contact information. And thank you all so much for coming. So.